Today, we are diving into a topic that affects every aspect of your well-being, the powerful interplay between your hormones and your mental health. So if you've ever struggled with anxiety, mood swings, brain fog, or even depression, then your hormones could be playing a bigger role than you realize. In this episode, we're going to explore the roles of estrogen, progesterone, cortisol, testosterone, and thyroid hormones, which affect your mood and emotions, and why the various times in your cycle, like PMS, even during postpartum and menopause, can trigger mental health challenges, and what the best natural strategies are to support both hormonal imbalance and emotional resilience. So if you've ever felt like your mental health is a roller coaster, then this episode is for you. So stay tuned. You won't want to miss this conversation. So welcome to the Holistic Health and Hormones podcast. I'm super excited to have Dr. Nicola Dillinger with us today. Dr. Nicola Dillinger has received her BA in International Health from Brown University in 1997, graduating with honors. She has graduated from the Southwest College of Naturopathic Medicine in Tempe, Arizona in 2004, and she's the founder of Pura Vida Natural Healthcare in Durango, and where she sees people locally and online. Dr. Nicola is an expert in the treatment of anxiety, depression, insomnia, and she connects people back to themselves. She's able to minimize supplementation and medication as the patients become empowered to heal themselves. She welcomes all patients regardless of age, ailment, and who are willing to invest in themselves. In addition to that, she leads groups in private retreats and also teaches a variety of online classes. In her free time, you can find her in the mountains, in the kitchen, and enjoying time with her husband, son, and their dogs. So welcome, Dr. Nicola. How are you?
Hi, thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, it's so good. Like, these days and age when you can talk to people all over the world, it's so amazing. And, we can all work from home, and that's really cool, and help, more and more people online. So thanks for joining us. I'm so excited to talk to you and, and our listeners about, the topic of the interplay between hormones and our mental health. It's so important given sort of what we've all gone through in the last few years. And I guess mental health, hear that mental health is on the rise, but there's not a whole lot around what the specific, I guess, practical advice as well as, the individualized advice. So we know that mental health is on the rise and that can influence our health, our hormones. But I'd love to hear from you sort of what your experience has been with the clients that you see, and really what do you believe and what's your sort of take on how hormones influence our mental health and our well-being?
Yeah, it's such a big question. I'm really glad we're going to at least touch on, the beginning of it tonight, because, at least in the States, we're seeing upwards of 60 to 70% of Americans reporting feeling anxiety, depression, substance abuse, suicidal, insomnia. And so that's a lot of us. And those are the folks that are reporting that they're feeling that way, right? So this is really becoming a huge issue in our local community, but certainly our global community as well. And so, really starting to look at all of the reasons why we might be experiencing mental health symptoms is really, really important. And I think one of the major things that we overlook is hormones. And, what piece of this could be hormonal, either from endogenous hormones, which is like the hormones that we make ourselves, or from hormones that we're taking in the form of birth control or hormone replacement therapy if we're looking at perimenopause, menopausal parts of our lives. And certainly if we're using fertility treatments, anyone who's gone through that knows that there's a wild swing.
So many hormones, right? As soon as you start, it's like a whole bucket full of hormones. Just before we jump into more about that, is there a difference that you see between men and women? Obviously, you've got different hormones, but do you work with a lot of men, and do you see the men sort of also letting their hormones affect their mental health, or do you predominantly notice it's more the females that it's because we go through, I guess, our menstrual cycle? Do men go through, hormones influencing their mental health as well? I guess with testosterone being the main hormone in men. We'll just quickly briefly touch on men, then we'll jump sort of more into the women. But I'd love to just hear your take about, men versus women and how that is a big difference.
It's a great question. And I would say, estrogen and progesterone certainly do affect men, and there is a cyclical nature to, monthly cycle for men as well. It's far less pronounced than we'll see in women. And so I think there can be a small component. I don't see that a ton in my clinic, but I certainly do see the impact of lower testosterone. And that can lead, besides libido and motivation, drive, self-confidence, we can really see that. And so it has this, when we have lower testosterone levels, we can see more the depressive kind of symptoms, just not really feeling effective in the world, not really feeling like they can go out and be their full selves. And so a lot of times when we look at, either supplementing with testosterone, but if we go backwards up the biochemical chain, DHEA is a hormone that makes testosterone, and we'll talk about it more with women. It also makes estradiol in everyone, but it also makes cortisol. And so understanding how we live in an endocrine soup, and that we can't talk about reproductive hormones without talking about stress hormones, without talking about thyroid hormones. They're all, it would be like, salting the soup and expecting the carrots to just be salty. It's really, they're all playing together. And so understanding that very specific interplay in men and in women around adrenal function and stress and our reproductive hormone production.
So on that, what would you say the biggest hormones, which hormones specifically are playing the major roles in regulating specifically mood and brain function? So let's jump back into the women. And so for the women, what are the hormones that are really impacting their mood and their brain function?
Absolutely. I mean, we have to look, certainly testosterone is also going to have, because in women, we want that same, we don't want the same levels of testosterone in women that we do in men, but we certainly want a robust amount relative for the female body. Mm-hmm. And so because then we can see the same kind of low drive, low libido, low motivation, that sort of thing. But really the main thing that we're looking at is that balance of estrogen and progesterone. And the kicker here is that low estrogen and high estrogen can actually have very similar presentations. We can see mood swings, we can see depression, irritability, tearfulness, hypersensitivity, and so it can be really tricky to sort out without testing, am I high or am I low? And, I think, and am I really sensitive to what we call phytoestrogens, or, those are estrogens found in plants, or xenoestrogens, estrogens that are found in our environment. And so that could be from, say, microwaving in Tupperware or with saran wrap over the top your dish, so we're going to have estrogen-like compounds from the plastic, or now we're seeing it in water supply as well, because so many people take hormones for so many things that our water filtration systems are having a hard time keeping up. So we can have, hormones and estrogens in our water. Estrogen is also used in meat production, but very specifically poultry. Because if you think about what excess estrogen does, it has us retain water and it plumps the breast. And so chicken is sold by the pound. Yeah. So when we have chicken that's more full of fluid and has plumper breasts, then it's going to be more marketable. And so estrogens are commonly used in cattle raising and chicken raising in order to increase weight and manipulate reproduction cycles in those animals.
So what would you say around people looking, obviously they want to be eating poultry and things. What is your suggestion around that and looking at food that is not going to play on their hormones as much?
Yeah. I think the most important thing is understanding where your food comes from, especially your animal products. If it's possible to connect with local farmers and find your meat locally so that you know what's actually being put in there, that's obviously ideal. Not everyone has access to that because of budget or location or geography. And then next best thing certainly would be looking for animals that have been processed without the use of hormones. And so just really looking for organic, and you'll see, organic or not raised with hormones or no BHT or that sort of thing. And so we'll see these things on the label of the meat that we're buying. And so we really want to try to minimize that. And if, again, budget is an issue for a lot of us, especially in the current economic climate, it's harder and harder to stretch our grocery dollars. And so I really would defer to putting those extra dollars into the chicken, because that is where we will see most of this. We'll see the highest concentration, I guess, of reproductive hormones.
It's so true. I think people aren't wary that the food that they're eating is actually contributing. And that's a lot of what it's coming from, apart from all of the other things in our environment, which we'll touch on a little bit later. But yeah, there is so much that we can do to minimize its effects and to help balance that. But what sort of hormonal imbalances, I guess, with all the mental, emotional, I guess, increases around the world, is there any hormonal imbalances that are mistaken for mental health disorders? Like some people are going through depression. Like I know from my own clients, like a lot of it is really just hormonal imbalances, right? The depression, they've been diagnosed by a psychiatrist or psychologist, whatever, but they haven't really looked at what are some of the ways they can really look at once their hormones are imbalanced, they're feeling a lot better. So, let's jump into that and talk a bit about, how it is significantly impacting the way it's expressed in the way they're feeling, whether it's anxiety, depression, or a swing between both.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, estrogen and serotonin are really, really linked. And so that is why some of us feel better in the first half of our cycle. And when I say the first half of our cycle, I'm talking about the first day of menstruation until about 14 days later.
Yeah.
When we have ovulation, right? And so that is when estrogen should be a little bit higher comparatively to the second half of our cycle, and progesterone tends to be a little bit lower. So our mood tends to be a little bit better. And progesterone does raise in the second half of the cycle. For most of us, that's not an issue. For some of us, that does create some depression. But both estrogen and progesterone drop in the few days before we have the start of our menses. And so we can feel really, really low. We can feel anxious. We can feel irritable, tearful, sensitive, those sort of things. And so really understanding, especially if you notice, I really recommend that people track their symptoms. And so, just start jotting down, and it doesn't have to be a journal entry that takes you 15 minutes. You just give yourself a 1 out of 10. My anxiety, my fatigue, my depression, motivation, energy, all the, mental clarity, because fogginess, and cognition is something that we don't associate with reproductive hormones, but oh my goodness, there's so much to say about estrogen, progesterone, and cognitive function, verbal processing, memory, both short-term and working memory, all of these things. And we can talk about that a little bit more in a moment, but really, to start to track it because I think when we try to look back over the last 8 weeks, if I'm like, well, what were the patterns? It's like, I don't know. It's just random. I hear that all the time. Yeah. But if you actually just take a moment, I'm talking 30 to 60 seconds, give yourself a 1 out of 10 in whatever symptoms you're feeling, and start noticing if there's a pattern. And for a lot of us women, there is, that we weren't aware of, because in our modern day culture, we're not really aware of our menstrual cycle and, the changes that come with it, because we're just, living our harried, full lives.
So when they do track, clients normally see patterns because it's been repeated month upon month, right? So they might notice that, their mood swings or their dip is coming, either just before their periods. And so once they start tracking, they're looking for, like you said, patterns, and then they can better manage or go, okay, now I'm aware this is coming. How can I, better manage this sort of time of the month of when they're getting specific cycles?
So and the other thing that I see when people start tracking is that there's a switch during ovulation in the mood. And because it's not, that mood swing or change isn't associated with the actual period, a lot of women aren't aware that it's associated with ovulation because it's month. And so again, these are just really important things, and everyone is going to manifest this individually. So, even though your best friend might have really bad PMS, that might happen for you 2 weeks prior, but it's still hormonally related.
So I guess with the hormonal shifts, what would you say are the differences? Let's talk about, we've just sort of mentioned the cycles, but what about during puberty? What have you seen with, I guess, someone who's just starting puberty, where their shifts, the hormone shifts are going through, what that's going to do to their mental, emotional state? I guess through even pregnancy, postpartum, and menopause. Can we just briefly touch on some of those major areas in I guess, a woman's life and what they're expecting to see in that mental, emotional space so that they know, oh, okay, I'm going through puberty. This is somewhat normal, or what is normal, that it's, you can be aware, okay, this can be part of my body going through the stages of especially if they're new into menarche, their periods have just come and, they're like, oh, what is all these hormones doing? Or straight after pregnancy when all of the postpartum stuff is happening, and even menopause. Like I was talking to a person at the gym this morning. She goes, I can't stop crying all the time. So yeah, I'd love to hear what you have to say about the different hormonal shifts and what is normal and what's not normal, I guess.
Yeah, great questions. The broad stroke that I would make is that each of these transition periods that you're talking about in life, the beginning of puberty, pregnancy, labor and delivery, which is different than pregnancy, and then menopause and menopause. These hormone shifts are very real. So I can't stress that enough. This is not in your head. This is not a question of willpower. This is not you being crazy, or just hormonal. We'll just kind of chalk it up to that. I mean, yes, it is hormonal, but there is very deep physiology happening in your body. So rather than blowing it off, hopefully what you hear more than anything else is to really take a look at how hormones might be impacting you and not just blow it off because, oh, hormones, everybody just, suffers with it. Because what we see in our cultures as being the norm doesn't make it normal. It doesn't mean that it's the way that it has to be. It is an indication of a imbalance or, a dysfunction is something that could be remedied. But just because it is happening frequently doesn't mean it's physiologically normal. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So because there's really important distinction.
Yeah. So much happening physiologically and chemically that is what is causing the shifts. And so depending on, I guess, what you're doing lifestyle wise, age wise, and what's happened, like it could be, how many kids you've had, or did your mom go through the same menopause? We can talk about genetics in a little bit, but yeah, it's all part of the physiology and the shifts that your body is going through due to cycles. Like we have cycles like moon cycles. We have cycles of puberty, pregnancy, postpartum, menopause. A lot of people, I guess, are scared of once they get to menopause, like they hear horror stories. Oh, this person's had long-standing, menopause symptoms for a decade, hot flushes. So I guess all the fluctuations, like you said, it's really understanding what's happening, physiology, and then we can talk a little bit later about what you can do to actually then manage that. So with some people experiencing those severe mood swings, I guess before a period and after, what do you see can help, or what is some of the awareness, like you said, apart from the tracking, during that sort of mood swings up and down through their different cycles, and even let's talk about sort of pregnancy and postpartum.
Sure. Yeah. So for the mood swings during periods, that is often due to a dip. And so what we want to do is really support serotonin production, because estrogen does support serotonin production. Serotonin is one of our neurotransmitters. That's a calming neurotransmitter. It's helping to self-soothe, to tell us everything's okay, to stay calm. It's one of our inhibitory neurotransmitters. And so we actually want a lot of serotonin on board so that we feel peaceful, that we feel less anxious, that we feel everything's going to be okay. And so if our estrogen is normally dipping right, in this, kind of right around ovulation, and then even more so right before our menses, we want to think about foods that have tryptophan naturally occurring in them. So things like turkey and eggs and dairy products, nuts and seeds, things like this. But even, depending on where you are with your dietary preferences or needs, just the simple eating of protein, because protein is built from amino acids. So when we break the protein down into amino acids are the building block for all of the neurotransmitters in our body. And so we want to really be, rich in protein and building blocks. In order to make some of these neurotransmitters go, we also need a lot of B vitamins. So B vitamins are depleted by the things we tend to crave. So sugar, caffeine, alcohol, kind of trans fats in, kind of junk foods type of options. And so just remembering, even if you're really, let's say, craving chocolate, or I'm not a regular coffee drinker, but a couple days before my period, I will really want a cup of coffee, or maybe even during my period. And sometimes I have it. It's not bad, but it's just becoming aware of like, oh, I'm really craving chocolate. Maybe I want some magnesium. Maybe I'm looking for serotonin because there is magnesium and serotonin in chocolate, or the caffeine, I'm looking for that energy boost. And so how are we really supporting our body? And if we are having sugar, caffeine, alcohol, what have you, being aware that those things do deplete B vitamins. And so maybe supplementing with some activated Bs, especially B6, which is particularly helpful for hormone production and balance.
Yeah, there's so much that people think, oh, right before my periods, they believe they're going crazy. They're eating like so much, and sometimes not the best foods, and they blame it on their periods coming. They know they're PMSing basically when they've got massive shifts in what they're craving that they don't have during the rest of the month, right? It's all coming right before their period. So yeah, so would you say that's fine? They should sort of lean into their cravings, or what should they be doing if that's the only way that they believe? I guess having severe PMS is not great either, but if it's just the things that they're craving, like a lot of time, sugar goes up, right? And, they might be eating a little bit more hangry at times, right? Hungry and angry.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's up to each person, but I think I would invite everyone to do a little experiment with themselves.
Right.
Like when I eat this, let's say very refined sugar, like Smarties or M&Ms or whatever it is that tickles your fancy, does it actually make you feel better? And 1 month, could you do a little experiment where you find some other sources of chocolate, let's say, and you look for dark chocolate that's more than 70% cacao. So this is going to be a darker, more bitter kind of chocolate, but it has more protein, more fiber, less sugar. And it's those bars are tending to be made with higher quality sugar, like pure cane sugar instead of corn syrup and that sort of thing. So how can we, on the spectrum of, I don't want us to feel like we're in denial of ourselves all the time, but how could we prepare? I have this recipe that I love, and it's equal parts. It doesn't matter how much of each, but it's equal parts cacao powder, almond butter, and coconut oil. And you just gently melt it all in a saucepan, and then you put them in the little mini muffin cups and then put them in the fridge. And so they're like little, kind of chocolate, and you could add a touch of maple syrup in there if you'd like. And if you want something to kind of take that bitter edge off, that's fine. Just don't, add an equal part of maple syrup. But even though maple syrup is going to be lower glycemic index, higher in B vitamins. So even if we are making that treat very, very sweet to kind of appease that palate, knowing that you're using a natural sweetener, it's going to be far better than those
sugar.
highly refined.
Highly refined sugar. Just a point on chocolate. I've always read that making sure that you're having chocolate which is organic, again, because we're minimizing, the amount of toxins and sprays on a lot of the cacao plants. They do get sprayed a lot with toxins. So, if you can look at organic dark chocolate, that is definitely your best bet, or make your own, like you said. That's a great
Absolutely.
So what would you say are some of what have you seen as a role of cortisol really, stress hormone? How does that play a part in our anxiety and depression? And what can we do to manage that cortisol so it's not, ramped up at the wrong times and causing a lot of that anxiety in us?
Yeah, well, like we were talking about earlier, DHEA is the precursor to both your reproductive hormones, primarily estradiol and testosterone, but also to cortisol. And so evolutionarily, we want to defer those resources down that fight or flight pathway. To be honest, it doesn't really matter if you get pregnant if you've been eaten by a saber-toothed tiger, right? So this is kind of evolutionarily how our pathways flow. And so we are going to divert those resources down that fight or flight pathway, leaving less raw materials to properly produce reproductive hormones. And so that's that interplay. So the more that we are triggering that stress response, the more we are stealing those raw materials away from reproductive hormone production so that we have lower levels of estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, which leads to lower mood, lower motivation, lower energy, right? The other thing is that when we have cortisol spikes all day long because we are not eating or because we are sitting at our computer all day, stressing out, trying to take care of all the things, or we're running harried from one place to the other, where it's just cortisol spiking all day long. And that can, in and of itself, can cause mood changes. So when we have high cortisol, we can feel anxiety and panic and just kind of that brain that won't shut off. And then when that cortisol drops in an hour or maybe 90 minutes, then we can feel irritable and grumpy and really not very resilient and tired and reactive. And so we can end up doing that all day long, especially when we throw in that nutrition component of, I'm just going to have a simple carb, a highly refined sugar. I'm going to have a pastry and a coffee because I'm tired and I just need a quick fix. Now we're back up on that cortisol spike and we're roller coastering all day long. And so really, the nutrition can be really balancing for that cortisol spike because even hunger is a stress cue. And so when we are hungry and we literally don't have calories on board, we will trigger the release of cortisol, which stimulates the release of stored sugar in the form of glycogen from your liver. And so then we're using our stored sugars in order to fuel our bodies. And so if we can eat, then we're kind of normalizing and leveling out that cortisol response. And so that's what we really want to play with. But then if we go into a deeper level of how do we not trigger that stress response, it's really how we're relating to ourselves, how we're relating to our daily lives, taking a deep breath, being in the car is a perfect opportunity to actually practice mindfulness. And so again, many of us feel like I don't have half an hour to meditate or an hour and 15 minutes to do yoga every day. Wouldn't that be nice? Kind of, attitude, especially if we've got kids or we're pregnant and jobs and families and, all the obligations that we've got going on. But so we want to find places that we can practice mindfulness that are already integrated into our day. So being in the car is that perfect opportunity. Every time you hit a stop sign or a stoplight, take one full deep belly breath. Use it as an opportunity to just really take your breath. Or even as you're driving along, and I do this all the time, and I always laugh like when the windows are down in the summertime, somebody's going to hear me, but even just when you take a big breath and then you actually vocally sigh on the way out.
Yes. Yeah, big sigh. It's great. It feels amazing, doesn't it, when we actually do a purposeful sigh?
It really does. And it stimulates prolactin, which is very relaxing to the entire nervous system. And so really we want to and there's a big connection between relaxing our throat and relaxing our second chakra and our pelvic floor and that sort of thing. And that's why it's so important for women during labor to vocalize. You really don't want to shut that vocal pathway down because then we shut the root and the second chakra down as well. And so we really just want to keep this movement. And so be it singing or sighing or chanting or belly breathing, whatever it is, to start doing that a little bit more. Maybe every time your computer or your phone pings because you've got a call or a message coming through, can you take one full breath and just notice like, okay, where am I at? How am I in relationship to this? What do I actually have to manage? That's one of my favorite questions right now is, do I really need to manage this or can I
put it off? I know we're so quick to respond, even with messages. I think, digital detoxing or something will calm our nervous system, or we're so wired And people
Yeah.
expect a response straight away, and they're always on their phones. So in fact, some more wired because they're seeing something they don't want to see. Or, there could be some good news, especially with my fertility clients, if they see someone's fallen pregnant and they're on this tough journey, it just brings up a lot of these emotions that we don't want. So it's like, how can we manage that and really look at, just small things every day that you can implement. So correct about we forget to deep breathe. A lot of clients are breathing, and you've probably seen the same. They don't really breathe from down in their, in their sort of lower abdomen. It's all very shallow breathing. And it's so important that when you actually take a full belly breath and be mindful of the breathing, like you don't have to spend 10 minutes or 20 minutes meditating. Just like you said, a couple of minutes if you're driving, or just if you have the awareness, maybe set an alarm for, every hour or two, just remind yourself to take a really good deep breath.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And kind of trying to imagine filling that pelvis up with air. A lot of times when I invite people to take a deep breath, I see the shoulders come up to the ears, kind of, kind of thing.
Like look in the mirror and see if you're actually keeping it solid, because we'll put your hands over your belly and see if you can feel that rise and fall is another tip, instead of like just, people just feel, it's on the chest. No, you can go deeper and deeper. It's just practice, and it's really that awareness, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. And if we have little kids, you can have them put a teddy bear on their belly, and you can all lay down and watch that together. So these are things that you can do as a family. And the more that we are regulating our own nervous system, then there's this thing called mirror neurons. So my neurological system is reading your neurological system. And so the more regulated I am, I actually assist you in becoming more regulated. And that's why, for those of us who are parents, we can, some of us especially are very attuned. Our children are very attuned to how we are. So even if we haven't said anything, it's like, the energy, oh my gosh, they're being crazy.
They can feel your crazy energy. I mean, you don't have to say anything. Your body language and the way you're breathing and the way you're like walking around. My kids can see it too. Some days you're just trying to get everything done as a busy parent with young kids, and they can feel you rushing. I mean, they've got no time. They've got no time concept sometimes, and you're rushing them more when they're like, on their own time zone. They can definitely feel that rushy energy, and they even slow you down even more, right? Instead of you saying, calmly, let's go. When you're like, come on, let's go. And then they're like, no, I'm just going to take my time. It's even more frustrating, and then it comes into a spiral. So good tips. Actually, if you've got kids, it's an amazing tip. Let's jump into, I guess, with thyroid. We're talking about fatigue and things earlier. And so, thyroid is such an important hormone, especially when it comes to fertility, our hormones. So what have you seen, and what is your experience with how thyroid is severely impacting, our mood and our function, our cognitive function?
Yeah. So when we have hyperthyroid, which is far less common than hypo or underfunctioning thyroid, we can certainly see that jittery, anxious, like really just a lot of disruptions in sleep. And a lot of times we will actually see this. This can be a result of labor and delivery. And so postpartum can often see that, and moms won't necessarily know what's going on. They just feel anxious. And a lot of us new parents will feel anxious because we have a child responsible for. Yes. And the world becomes a much scarier place. Yes. But again, it's really important to get your thyroid tested. Postpartum, like immediately following labor and delivery, our reproductive hormones are as low as they will be until menopause. Wow. And so it's really, really, really low. They're almost menopausally level low because we've had up to 100 times increase, especially in that first trimester of progesterone. So progesterone, progestation, right? So that's hormone that comes on full on during an initial pregnancy, and especially that first trimester. But that can leave us feeling depressed and teary and that sort of thing. And these hormones get very, very high during pregnancy. And then we have delivery, and they really just bottom out. And that's what can lead to this postpartum depression, or just low mood, or baby blues, but again, it's can be really disorienting, especially as a new mom, to know what's normal, around just reorienting your whole life to being a mother. Or if you've already had other children, how do we now do this dynamic and take care of the older kids and the new baby as well. And so there's just a lot to manage. And many of us have the pressure of a short maternity leave and having to go back to work. And so that's imminent. And so anyway, there's a lot happening with all of that. And so thyroid, that's where I was going. I was like, where did that come from? So thyroid can be very, very impacted by labor and delivery was the point of my story. And then hypothyroid, which is what we see most commonly, is this underfunctioning as a thyroid. So it can have us feeling really lethargic and foggy headed, weight gain, constipation, that sort of thing. And so we really want to make sure that we're not just looking at TSH when we're talking to our GP, but we really want to ask for free T3 and free T4 as well, because those are the actual thyroid hormones. So the TSH is a hormone actually from our brain that's thyroid stimulating hormone. So it comes from the brain, stimulates the thyroid, but that
can appear normal, right? That can appear normal, and then you've got the free T3 and T4, which can be completely off.
That's exactly right. Absolutely. And then there's a very common autoimmune issue called Hashimoto's that can be associated with thyroid as well, where we see this rise in thyroid function. And so we see a lot of kind of anxiety and revved sort of energy and followed by a really deep crash. And that is not uncommon postpartum as well.
Yeah, there's a lot. So I guess you just sort of mentioned a few things we could test for. What are some of the other tests, if you're listening, for those listening, like that they could go out and maybe just ask for a test from their GP or their practitioner if they suspect any sort of imbalance that we're talking about, sort of in puberty, even in sort of the postpartum times, like if they're feeling any sort of imbalance along their sort of reproductive sort of times of, whether they're in puberty or preconception, postconception. I guess there might be slight changes, but what are some of the basic tests? If you've got a test, you're feeling really off, what are some of the things you may ask your GP to have a look at for you?
Yeah, I think with the GP, you certainly want to look at a CBC, which is your complete blood count. Yes. So is there some anemia happening, and not just, kind of your hemoglobin, but also two pieces of that called MCV and MCH. And those typically run a little bit on the high side. And when they do, that's often indicative of either a B12 or a folic acid deficiency. And so we really want to look at those closely, even if they're in the normal range. If they're at the higher end of normal, that could indicate this B12 or folic acid deficiency, which has a huge impact on energy, depression, anxiety, mental health in general. And so that's a very simple, very common baseline test for any GP the world over. Will run a CBC for you. Yeah, I promise. And then we want to look at, iron and ferritin can be helpful as well. That can be very, very important, especially if we've been having heavy menses. And then hormonally, I find that blood tests are relatively limited for a couple of reasons. One is that our hormone production throughout the day is pretty cyclical. And so depending on when we go get our single blood draw, we may or may not be in a trough or a low. We really don't know where we are. Yeah. And we also are rarely asked where we're at in our cycle when we get our blood drawn. And so then when we get the things back, and then there's 5 different parameters depending on where you were in your cycle, they're like, well, I don't know where I was.
Yeah. If you've got a very regular cycle, right? It's all over the place. Yeah, it's not the typical 28 days. You can go, okay, I'm going to get a blood test done on cycle day 2, 3, perfectly on day 21. It's not always going to happen for some, especially even menopause, right? If you're going through perimenopause or menopause, you're all over
the place.
Yeah,
absolutely. So I typically recommend either a saliva test or a urine test. Partially because then with the saliva test and the urine test, we're taking 4 samples in the same day. So then we're really pooling those results, and we have a better chance of getting the average amount. The urine test allows us to see metabolites downstream. How is our liver processing these hormones? What are we doing with them? And those tests to me are more comprehensive in that they give us the 3 different types of estrogen. So estrone, estradiol, and estriol. We're looking at progesterone, testosterone, and DHEA. They can also, if you opt, they can look at your cortisol function as well. And again, cortisol should be nice and high in the morning and kind of ski slope down as the day goes on. And so how else are we finding that information unless we're testing throughout the day? And most of us, when we're getting our blood drawn, we're going to have a little bit of a cortisol response from getting a needle put into our arm. And so I don't find
it might be more stressful, because then, you spikes it in your results as well. Yeah, and I'm a big fan of the Dutch test and testing your metabolites, through the 4 or 5 times a day for sure. Yeah, that's a great tip. I guess before we sort of wrap up, what are some of the diet and lifestyle factors, just as a guide or a generalization that can really help you to regulate your hormones better, help you with having better mental health? We've covered a few things in terms of organic foods and looking at organic protein specifically. What other sort of diet and lifestyle factors do you recommend?
Yep. One of the easiest things is increasing your fiber. Fiber is like room for the gut. And so really we want to think about, we'll talk about the liver just here in 1 second here.
Liver and gut. There's so much.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Always. It's always the answer.
Yes.
But once the liver has processed the hormones and put them into the intestines to be eliminated, fiber is the broom that carries all of that waste out of the system. And so the more we can have a high fiber based diet, then the more sweeping out of the eliminated waste happens, and the more we're just clearing it out of our system. If we are not pooping regularly, then those toxins or those hormones that have been discarded are kind of sitting in the bowels, and there's a potential for reabsorption and recirculation into the system. And anything that grows under the ground, anything that's a root veggie. So carrots, parsnips, turnips, sweet potatoes, beets, all of those things. Anything that grows under the ground is going to be very supportive for your liver. And your liver is the powerhouse of your body. It is where
cleanses, detoxes, right? Yes. I mean, we wouldn't be alive without our liver. It's just like, it's the biggest work organ in the entire body. Like, it works nonstop. It's processing everything, right? It's one of the hardest working. I reckon it's harder working than your mind, your brain, and your heart. It does so much. Yeah. And people don't realize that they're ruining their liver. They're not sleeping well. They're drinking excessive amounts of alcohol, right? And let alone all the other things they come in contact with. But yeah, it's very important. So liver health, let's talk quickly about gut health. Like you said, if you're constipated, people think, oh, it's normal. My whole life I poop every 3 days, right? But it's not normal. Look at all the food that you're eating and what's accumulating in the 3 days. And you need to go to the toilet. You need to have a daily bowel motion, right? At most, sort of 24, 36 hours at most. But yeah, you should be ideally going daily or more than once daily, right? Because that will really impact your hormone, your mood with that gut-brain connection. Can we quickly mention sort of around that gut-brain connection that most people starting to be aware of but don't know a lot about?
Absolutely. I mean, if you think about it from your mouth to the end, it's one tube. And so really it's kind of the one in, one out rule, so like as we take in a meal, we should be making room for that meal by eliminating, yesterday's meals. Yeah. So, so people are like, that means 3 times a day. I'm like, that's physiological normal, right? Is kind of moving the tube. Most of us aren't eliminating like that in our modern culture, but really, at least, like you said, once a day, we really want to be moving the waste out of the body. And the other thing to remember is that your gut has its own nervous system called the enteric nervous system that operates independently of your brain and central nervous system. And so most of your neurotransmitters, like 80 to 90%, are actually formed in your gut. Right? They were discovered in the brain first, which is why they were called neurotransmitters, but most of the production is actually in the gut. And so really supporting your body with, again, it's going to be the same things, like a diet rich in fruit and veg, high in fiber, organic proteins, really limited on the refined stuff. And, we have a pancreas to help us digest sugar. We have our liver that can help us digest alcohol. So when we have these things occasionally, it's not going to harm us. It's when it's with that repetitive, it's kind of like if I asked you to do the dishes after dinner, you'd be like, yeah, sure, no problem. But as soon as your dishes were done, I put another pile of dishes and another pile of dishes and another, eventually you get tired. Our organs are the same. And so it's not about never doing these things or never enjoying doing these things. Please enjoy your life fully. But it's about thinking about rest. So digestive rest,
Yeah.
liver, the time to rest from having to detoxify, the brain, time to rest from having to process information. All of these different organ systems, just like your spirit, need a break. And we as humans need a break as well. And so as we talk about, how do we nourish ourselves? It's not just about the food that we're eating, but it's about the messages that we're giving ourselves and that we're
Self-love,
receiving.
right? Because a lot of us are forgetting that we're putting everyone else first and we're not really spending the time to eat well, to take those few moments to breathe and to be able to look in and go, what can we do to really nourish our body, our soul? What are we doing that is keeping us happy, right? A lot of us are just doing the things every day that make us miserable. Like we might hate our workplace, but if you were to look at maybe a better workplace that you would feel happier in, it would completely shift your health, right? It's not worth your health by, even if it's a pay, you have a little bit less pay, but you're in a much healthier environment, you're going to be healthier in the long term. So
that's exactly right.
Yeah. So I know there's so much there to unpack. So I guess as we wrap up, what are some sort of one piece of advice you give to someone struggling with hormonal imbalances and some mental health challenges? What would be like your great one piece of advice? I know there's lots, but what would be a couple of key things that you would suggest they start looking at?
One is if you are on any sort of birth control, including an IUD, a hormonal IUD, don't believe the hype that it has no impact on your mood. I cannot tell you how many of my patients I've seen and their symptoms started around the time that they started this new birth control. It's
flatlining your hormones, right? You're literally not having that natural progesterone and estrogen each month.
Yeah. And so it can very, very much impact your mental health. And even if your primary or OBGYN or whoever you're asking says no, go talk to your pharmacist and they will tell you the truth, or go look it up online. And there are options out there that don't require external hormones for birth control. Is it trickier sometimes? Yes, it can be, but this is not the only option. And not having our monthly cycle is not because the uterus is trying to detoxify as well. It's an organ of elimination. And so we're meant to eliminate regularly and shed that lining, not only physiologically, but spiritually as well.
That's right. Yes.
And so we want to make sure that there's movement and fluidity there. And really, I guess so that's like the one like public service announcement is that hormonal birth control does impact your mood. I promise.
Let alone the long-term effects. So we won't have time to get into that.
I mean, that's a whole other question, but
hormonal, like irregularities and people not getting their periods back for 2 years. Like that's, so yes, no oral contraceptive.
Yeah, but I've had so many women in their knowing be like, I know this is impacting me, but I went to my doctor and they told me that was impossible.
There's no other option. Yeah.
Well, or there's no other option, but they told me that what I'm feeling and these hormones they're not related. And I'm like, no, they might be. It's not always. And some women do really, really well on these interventions. It's not across the board. But if you have a question mark about the hormones that you're putting into your body and whether or not they're impacting you on that mental, emotional level, please take the time to explore that. And then I guess from my heart to yours is for everyone to really honor what is happening for you. We are all such unique bodies but we look to each other. But again, we have this knowing, we have this internal wisdom around how things should be. And so when that feels awry, when that feels off, when you have this kind of niggling kind of thing that just won't leave your consciousness, don't brush yourself off. Listen to that, explore that. Yeah, really, really, really. And again, just because something is happening a lot doesn't mean it's normal and doesn't mean that you need to put up with it, or doesn't mean you need to shut down your body's process because it's been so painful or so heavy or so difficult that we just want to shut it down. I understand that impulse very much. And there are so many other things, acupuncture, herbs, Chinese herbs, Western herbs, nutritional interventions, supplements and amino acids. There's so many things that we could do to help your body come back into balance. And if you are manifesting a symptom, it is your body's divine message. It is your body's trying to get your attention. And so rather than suppress it or just wanting to turn it off, how can we actually get closer to what this is and receive the gift that our body's trying to give us?
It's so amazing. Our bodies are such unique things, and it's so, it's really there to help us and support us, but we have to support it in the process. So thank you so much for your tips, Nicola. We could talk for hours on this. There is so much, insights already you've given to our listeners. So thank you so much for joining us. I hope you got a lot out of our conversation today. And please like our podcast. If you've got any questions, pop it in the comments for Dr. Nicola or myself, and I'll post any links that we have to her work. So thank you so much for coming on. And yeah, it was such a great conversation. We'll see you.
Thank you so much. It's really my honor. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for tuning in to the Holistic Health and Hormones podcast. If you found today's episode inspiring or informative, please don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review. It will help us reach more people just like you who are on their journey to vibrant health and balance. For more tips, resources, or to work with me, please visit my website or connect with me on socials. And remember, your health is your superpower. So keep nurturing it, and I'll see you next time.